we need to set up a new task definition for our worker service, but it will use the same image our Rails app is using. Let's start by pushing up our new image. Now, let's create our new task definition. Since we're using the same underlying image and we'll need to set up the same environment variables, it'll be easier to create our new task definition based off of the existing web task definition we created a few videos back. Before we do that, we need to set up a couple of new environment variables on our existing web task definition. For that, we need to select the latest version of our web task definition and click Create New Revision. Once we're in the configuration page, we need to scroll down and select our Producaton container. Scroll down a bit and add these environment variables: Gmail username, Gmail password, factory URL, factory provider, and note factory provider is needed in the current version of the factory worker Ruby gem we are using, but in the current master branch it is not required. It only references the environment variable that the factory services URL is set to. Once we've added that, we can save the new revision of our web task definition. Now, we can move on to creating our new task definition for our worker service. Let's start by selecting the latest revision of our web app task definition and clicking Create New Revision. From here, we need to change two things. First, we need to change the name of our task definition to worker. Then we need to scroll down to our Producaton container and click on it. Once we are in the model for our container settings, we need to set the command to bundle exec factory worker. After that, we can scroll to the bottom and click Update. Then, after the model screen disappears, we can scroll to the bottom and click Create. We should now have a new task definition named worker, and we can move on to creating our new service for the worker. Now that we have our task definition set up, let's create our worker service. To do that, we need to navigate over to our clusters dashboard and click Create. We're going to choose these options, leaving the rest as their defaults to create our service. Launch type, Fargate, task definition, worker, service name, worker, number of tasks, 1. Then click Next Step. For our network settings, we're going to choose Cluster VPC, the same cluster VPC that was used to configure our other services. Subnets, the same subnet that was used to configure our other services. Then click Next Step. For our auto-scaling, we'll leave it at the default and click Next Step. Lastly, look over the configuration and make sure everything is correct and click Create Service. After we've created our service, we can click the View Service link to go to the dashboard for our service. After a minute or so, we'll probably see that the service fails to start. This is because we haven't given our worker service access to the factory service. We can follow the same steps above that we used to provide access to our Rails app. Once we've edited the rules, it should look similar to this. Now we can restart our new service. After a moment, we can navigate back to our AWS console and see that our worker service is now running. We can verify that we've successfully connected to the factory service by visiting the page and looking at the number of connections. We can also go into our Rails app, try to share a checklist, and verify that the action triggers a new background job. Oops, it looks like we forgot to give our worker service access to our database. Let's correct that and try again. As you can see, there were a few failure attempts while I was making the changes. This was caused by me creating a few additional background jobs, which retired before I could update the settings. But now, we're finally able to run background jobs. Yay! Today we cloned our existing web app task definition to create our worker task definition and set up a worker service. However, with all that we've done, there are still a few more improvements that could be made for real production usage. First, does it actually make sense to run Factory as a service using ECS? As of now, we don't have a good way of pointing the other services to it outside of using the internal IP address. We could have put the service behind a load balancer, but that doesn't really make sense since we're not going to run more than one instance of Factory. With the current configuration, if we have to restart the Factory service, it will get a new IP address assigned and we'll need to update the task definition for both the web app and worker. Another potential issue is that we didn't mount an external volume and use that as the data store for Factory. So if you were to restart the Factory service, you would lose any jobs left in the queue. In closing, I hope you've enjoyed learning some of the basics of setting up Faktory and encourage you to take a look at the Faktory documentation. Thanks!